Good morning, First Congregational Church, and good morning, community of Langsburg. Welcome to our online service. My name is Dr. Tom, and it is good to have you with us today. We are in the liturgical season of Ordinary Time, and we are exploring the book of Mark in a series entitled Ordinary Revolution. Today we got a passage out of Mark chapter 5, which is commonly called the Markan sandwich, because there's a story that's split into two, like a hamburger bun, and then there's a story fit into the story that's split into two. So it starts interrupted and keeps on going. So you're gonna hear some really interesting thoughts about what this story is and what it is not. We invite you along for the ride today, and we'll see you soon. All right, so let's do a quick little recap of the story we're talking about here. It's out of Mark 5, and it's verses 21 through 43 to the end of the chapter 5. We're not gonna read the whole thing word for word. Here, you can do that on your own if you'd like. But just a recap of the story, Jesus has just come back across the Galilean lake. Last week, we saw him go to one side of the lake. There was a calming of the storm. We're skipping a story in the liturgical calendar where Jesus heals this demon-possessed guy in a graveyard in Gentile pagan territory. That's a fun story for a different time. So he's coming back from that, and he lands on the other side of the Galilee lake. And there is, again, large crowds that like to follow Jesus, especially in the book of Mark, because he's doing a lot of things. He's doing a lot of miracles and doing a lot of healings and stuff. So this word gets out that Jesus does healings and miracles, and a well-respected synagogue leader, we'll explore what that means here pretty soon, comes to Jesus and says, I need you to come and lay your hands on my daughter. She's near death, she's sick, and you can heal her. Jesus says, let's go. So they start going that direction. Now here's where the sandwich comes in. That's the top bun. Now here's the middle section. The story is interrupted by a woman who has had a bleeding condition for 12 years and has finally, she spent all her money, she's seen every doctor, and she comes and thinks in her head, she says, if I could just, I don't need to bother the guy, but if I could just touch his robe, I'll be healed and I'll be good. And I won't even have to bother the guy. So she works her way through the crowd, touches Jesus's robe, she gets healed, and Jesus all of a sudden stops. He's like, wait, who touched me? And the disciples are confused, saying, we're in a crowd, everyone's pressing up against you. What do you mean who touched you? Like, that guy touched you, that guy touched you, that guy touched you. So I was going through, he says, no, this is different. And the woman finally, she comes forward, she says, that was me. And Jesus looks at her and says, your faith has made you well, go in peace. So now that was the meat in the middle, like the hamburger. Now the bottom bun, so while he's done talking to this woman, some people from Jairus' house come to him and says, don't bother the teacher, your daughter died in process here. So let him go and we can just go home. And Jesus says, no, she's not dead, let's go. So he arrives at Jairus' house, everyone's doing the mourning, and he basically kicks everybody out of the house. He takes her by the hand, lifts her back up, raises her from the dead. Everyone is amazed. And then Jesus says, don't tell anybody what happened here. And that's the story we're looking at today. It's called the Markan sandwich. We got the two buns and the hamburger right in the middle. All right, this is a tough passage because we bring specific baggage to the passage. We bring specific questions to the passage that might not be the intention of the author to be asking and answering. So when we do that, when we bring our questions and our baggage to a passage and try to seek answers, specific answers from a passage to questions that it's not asking, we can run into some problems. We can run into some road bumps, which is why I've had a tough time with this passage this week, being one who suffers from chronic health issues quite frequently. The questions that I bring to this passage are kind of, what exactly was it about the faith of this woman that healed her, and why is it that the faith of some other people, they don't experience healing? So these are the questions that I brought to the passage, like, what's the formula here? Did she have some magic words? Did she have some, did she do a little rain dance beforehand? Or like, what is it that she had or did that, I am missing or don't have or I'm not doing in my life to trigger some kind of miraculous healing event, right? So these are the questions that I bring. They're based on my personal baggage, but this passage is not trying to tell us, here's the formula, here's the way, here's how your faith can, move God's hand to heal you from all of your diseases. That's not the question, that's not the topic that this passage is attempting to answer. So if we're going to get through our baggage and approach this passage the way it would like us to approach this passage on its terms and not our terms, then we need to figure out what are the questions that this passage is asking. What is the important themes that this passage is addressing? And then when we get to there, then we can find kind of the passage's intention, and then we can come to some conclusions on the other side about what it can mean in our life. Now, these questions, it's not that they're unimportant, because the scriptures ask these questions. The Psalms especially ask questions of God, why is it that the wicked prosper while the righteous, don't? Why is it? So these questions are asked in the Bible. So it's not that the Bible doesn't address this topic, but the Bible, although these questions are asked, the Bible doesn't offer direct answers to the problem of evil or theodicy or whatever you want to call it. The Bible doesn't directly give us a, out of our back pocket answer and say, here you go. So the purpose is that these questions go unanswered, but the questions asked aims our gaze beyond the question to a broader hope, to a broader picture, to a greater timeline than my personal comforts in the here and now. And that can feel really insufficient when you're in the midst of pain, sickness, struggling, suffering, all that kind of stuff. And that feeling of that being insufficient is okay, because that's part of the journey of faith in itself. We don't have to be fine with it. We don't have to be okay with it. We don't have to be comfortable with it. We don't even have to be happy with it, because that's not what hope is supposed to generate within us. Hope takes our eyes beyond the here and now and puts it into a further context, out there, because the truth of the matter is nobody gets through life unwounded. Nobody's going to get through this life and not have some kind of a wound. Faith is not a lucky rabbit's foot that keeps disaster at bay, that keeps tragedy far away from us, that keeps blessings flowing into our life and sufferings far from us. That's not what faith is, because nobody gets through life unwounded. Prayer is not this hotline to God that rescues us from uncomfortable situations. And Jesus is not some genie in a bottle that grants wishes to those who are faithful, to those who, say the right magic words or do the right dance or have the specific amount of faith needed for it to happen. So if that's not what this passage is about, how to get healed or how to experience blessing or how to get God to move in your favor, if that's not what it's about, then what is this passage about? That's what we need to explore in the next section here. The first thing I want to note is that the number 12 is used, and I think this is the primary understanding for what Mark is trying to say in this passage, that Jesus is miracle here. So there's a girl that's 12 years old, and there is a woman that's been sick for 12 years. This number 12 is jammed into this passage for a reason. What does the number 12 symbolize? In the Bible, it came to be known, the number 12 is the number of God's people, the complete God's people. Who's included in God's people? That's the number 12. There were 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament, and these made up the whole nation of the Hebrew people. Jesus then chooses 12 apostles to kind of revamp the people of God for the new age, the Messianic age here. So this number 12 is now, this is God remaking who's in, who the people of God are. And then this story takes that further and expands who is included in the people of God and who is included as being important in the kingdom of God. Now, this is a highly patriarchal society where women are considered property that you exchange to another family for a dowry if you're going to marry your daughter off. You needed twice as many women in court to make up for a man's testimony as a woman's testimony. It's very highly sexist and patriarchal in this society. So for this passage to take a little girl and a woman and make them the star of the show, make them healed, and use this number 12 to show that they are included in the kingdom of God and what God is now currently doing, it expands everyone's understanding of what God is doing. So that's one comparison here, is that this number 12 expands here that we have these two female characters. One's a child, one's a woman. It also goes to expand who can come, because these are two now unclean individuals. One is unclean through death, and you're not allowed to touch a dead or dying person, according to the book of Leviticus. And then this woman is unclean because of the flow of blood she's experiencing, and that was a religious puritanical code from the book of Leviticus that is obviously highly sexist. But this here was Jesus expanding who's included to these people who are considered to be outsiders and pushed out and pushed to the edges and fringes of who's allowed to belong. If you were ceremonially unclean, you weren't allowed to touch anyone, because then they would be ceremonially unclean. So you were deprived of physical human contact. You were looked down upon, and you weren't allowed to worship in community in the temple. There was a lot of things that you were restricted from. And here Jesus does this healing, one healing from a dead person, healing from a sick person. This healing is not just a healing of physical ailments, but a restoration of these people back into the community. And that number 12 is supposed to show us that this is a healing and a restoration that's supposed to expand our minds on who we think is included and who we think is allowed to come into the presence of God, by taking current narrow understandings and blowing the doors off the whole thing. So what is this story about? We did some comparison, contrasting. and we learned a couple of key elements of this story. This story is this grand reversal of expectations. Now let's look at Jairus for a minute. Jairus is going to be a well-respected person in the community, an elder. He's going to have financial resources. People are going to be, he probably has some servants that he has employed in his house. He probably has a lot of resources, being higher up and well-respected, an elder, a pastor of the community. So to be kind of a synagogue leader is to be what modern day people would know to be a pastor. And in this day where the church was the government, the church was the central reality for the way that they all lived and moved as a national understanding, to be someone of that stature is to be very well respected, well resourced, and well to do. Now the perception of the day is that someone like this has been blessed by God. Obviously they have all of this good stuff going for them. They have their health, they have their financial prowess, they have their respect in the community, they have a position in the synagogue. God must have blessed this person for being such an amazing person. So the expectation here is that Jairus has been blessed by God because he obviously did some things right in his life. Now tragedy hits Jairus's life with his daughter becoming sick, and causes him to become very desperate and fall before this traveling fringe rabbi hippie preacher guy named Jesus that nobody knows what to do with, but everyone's following him around. And he says, there's something, I need to seek this guy out, because Jairus is confused. He had this understanding that he was blessed by God. And then tragedy hits, and immediately his understanding, his household's understanding, and the community's understanding is, what did he do? What did he do, or someone in his family do, in order to bring the judgment of God down upon his life, upon his daughter's head? There must have been something he screwed up with somewhere. And we can see this in a different gospel story where they're walking, Jesus and his disciples are walking by a blind man in the Gospel of John. They said, all right, what did he do, Jesus, to receive such a curse on his life? What did he do? Or was it his parents? And Jesus says, that's not how this happened. And he's correcting that common understanding that blessing is for those who have their lives all put together, and curses are for those who don't. So Jairus, this person who has his life all together, experiences this tragedy, and there's public confusion going on. Why has he been cursed? What happened here? And it stirs a desperation in his heart. It stirs humility, coming in contact with his own mortality and fragility of who he is as a father. And he gets desperate and goes to Jesus. Now, this woman comes, and this woman doesn't have a name in this story, which I think is ironic. Jairus has a name. He's a prominent figure in the story. He's given the dignity of a name, whereas this woman is just the woman with the problem. And she has not been given a name, but has been given a label. She's unclean. She's undignified. She's an outsider. And obviously, we're not sure what she did, but she is cursed by God for having this issue fall upon her head. That was the common understanding of the day. So she also hits this desperation point, and then privately sneaks up to Jesus. I don't even got to bother the guy, I just got to touch his robe and I'll be all fine. And presses through the crowd, which is illegal to be touching all these people and making them all ceremonially unclean in a sneaky manner like this, and touches Jesus, the fringe of Jesus' robe. She just disobeyed like every religious code that was given to her at this point. But she did so with this strong faith that I don't even got to talk to the guy, I just need to touch his robe and everything will be fine. So she has this humiliated and desperate character to her, where Jairus has this prestige and power and understanding to him, and these two people are going to be brought into a level playing field because they're both experiencing suffering and tragedy. They're both experiencing pain, and this is the great equalizer. suffering has a way of bringing us into contact with our own mortality, our own humanity, our own fragility. You see, because all of the resources in life, while they're important and they're useful to a certain degree, they also can be used as insulators, protecting a sense of security that we have that may or may not be actually true. Jairus thought he was all good, all secure, and in need of nothing because he had everything, and tragedy hits, and all of a sudden he's in desperate condition and falling, just humiliating himself and falling before Jesus on his knees. A well-respected community leader would never undignify himself in such a manner unless it was absolutely desperate cause here, which we see just how desperate he is with that action, where the woman is already in a humiliated state and degraded and brought low, and she just gonna push through the crowd and touch Jesus's hem, and he is going to honor Jairus' request, but he also stops and pays attention to this woman who's not given the dignity of a name in this story, but just a label. And it's meant to exemplify her faith, but it's also meant to be the great equalizer, because Jairus was up high and she was down low, and this suffering actually brings them onto the level playing field of common humanity, because Jairus can no longer just use all of his insulators to keep himself safe, and she is no longer a subhuman standard down here. They both come onto this equal humanity playing field and interact with Jesus as equals of this day. And that is absolutely radical in the culture and context of this passage. Suffering brings us into contact with this ground of our own being by taking away all of the insulators that we use to try and convince ourselves that we're the lords of our own life and that we can control, which way the wind's going to go in our own life. Whether we're respected or not, whether we're rich or not, whether we're insiders or outsiders, whether we're successful or not considered successful, it doesn't matter when suffering hits. When suffering and tragedy hits, all of a sudden we're all on level playing field, in touch with our common mortality, humanity, and fragility. And this story is the great equalizer. It's not a story about how to get healed and how to have faith enough to get healed. This story is a story that is equalizing all of humanity on a level playing field in God's eyes before everyone, saying, who's welcome to come? Who's welcome to come? Anybody's welcome to come. And when we finally get back in touch with the ground of our being and the reality of ourself and who we are, then we can approach God with it. Whether we've been degraded and we're too low, we need to be brought back up. Or whether we are kind of prideful and pompous and we need to be brought low, both are acts of God's love. This is because the psalmist says here, we got to see this here. The psalmist says that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And this isn't an act of God's judgment to bring low the exalted. This is an act of God's love, because we can't approach God on our terms with our, with all of our insulators in place and show God all of our stuff and all of our toys and all of our accomplishments and all of our titles and all of our, degrees and all of our jobs and all of our anythings. We can't do that with God. They don't impress God. Who you are impresses God. And for the exalted to be humbled is an act of God's love, so that we can actually encounter God in the real places of our own humanity. And for the humbled to be exalted is not a grand reversal switching places like this. It's the equalizer that brings everyone into contact with God in the reality of their own being. So we have to see that before we move on to the applications, or this story just becomes mental insulation from our humanity, allowing us to distinguish ourselves from those who suffer, like Jairus was able to for so long. And those who are outside until something, tragedy or suffering, whatever, hits us and leaves us in disillusionment as well. So we have to see that before we jump to applications, or we're going to have that dangerous propensity to just make it a story about how to experience blessing in God's life and healing, and it's going to become some form of a prosperity gospel to us if we're not careful. Okay, so this story is not about you. This story is not about me. This story is not about your pain, suffering, or grief, or sickness, or whatever you're going through. This story is not about how to get God to intervene in your life. This story is not about any of that. This story is about God. This story is about God's authority. This story is about God's kingdom. This story is about who is invited and included to come into that kingdom. This story is about an undignified woman who confidently touches Jesus, and the dignified clergyman who humbly falls before him. And this grand equalizing of these two people shows us that since God became human in Christ, then we encounter God not by becoming more than human or becoming some kind of demigod, but we encounter God through our humanity, through the ground of our being. Not a humiliated denigration of being brought down into the dirt, and not a lofty demigod perfection of look how religious and moral and pure I am and holy. Just us, as we are, who we are. This is how we come into the kingdom of God, by getting in touch with the ground of our being, getting in touch with our humanity and the shared humanity that we all have as a human race. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining me out here. I was getting this in before the rain hits. We're having a stormy weekend this weekend. But thank you for joining us here on our online service. If you want to be a part of our community, make sure to like and follow our page or subscribe to our YouTube page. And you will be notified whenever we put new information up here. And if you want to partner with us in a financial capacity, there is a link here at the bottom of your screen. Right there, you can type that in right up there, and any financial support you want to send our way would be greatly appreciated as we seek to be a place of hope and help and healing, expanding this message of God's grace and inclusion and love and kindness to everywhere we can get, here in our own community of Langsberg and out and beyond into the interwebs of everywhere. So we'll see you next week. We have another story from the Gospel of Mark that we're going to explore. And yeah, we'll see you then. Have a great week. And then another comparison is that they're both, how do you do? Well, that was fun.